Alina's fingers traced the embossed HOA letterhead, her mind racing back to the day she first fell in love with this property. It wasn't just a house. It was a canvas, a living ecosystem waiting to be understood and nurtured. The violation notice trembled slightly in her grip. Her daughter Sophia, a precocious 12-year-old with her mother's fire, peered around the kitchen doorway. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Alina responded, her voice a carefully controlled mixture of frustration and determination. But they both knew she wasn't fine. This was war. The property had been more than just a home since Alina bought it 17 years ago. It was a testament to her family's journey, her late parents' immigrant spirit, her own professional passion, her children's roots. Every plant, every stone had a story. The native azaleas her mother had planted the summer before she passed away. The drought-resistant succulents that marked Alina's first professional landscape design project. The herb garden where Sophia learned about ecology and sustainability. Gerald Whitmore knew none of this. To him, Alina's garden was nothing more than a rebellious patch of green that dared to challenge the cookie-cutter aesthetic of Magnolia Estates. She remembered the neighborhood when she first moved in. A bland landscape of identical lawns, perfect but lifeless. Rows of identical houses with postage stamp yards maintained by landscaping crews who treated each plot like a military installation. Pristine, uniform, soulless. Alina had different ideas. Her professional background as a landscape architect had taught her that gardens were more than decoration. They were living ecosystems, intricate networks of plant life, insects, and microorganisms. Each plant she chose served a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. The native grasses prevented soil erosion. The carefully selected flowering plants supported local pollinators. The strategic placement of plants created natural cooling and reduced the need for excessive water and maintenance. But Gerald and the HOA board saw only chaos where Alina saw complexity. They wanted uniformity. She offered biodiversity. The $250 fine was just the beginning. The daily penalties would accumulate quickly if she didn't correct her landscaping. But correction to Alina meant destruction of a carefully cultivated ecosystem. Her phone buzzed. A text from her brother Marco. Saw the HOA letter. Need backup. A small smile crossed Alina's lips. Marco was an environmental lawyer who had been looking for exactly this kind of case, a chance to challenge outdated suburban regulations that prioritized appearance over ecological responsibility. Sophia wandered into the kitchen, her science project spread across the table. A detailed diagram of local plant ecosystems. "Mom," she said, pointing to her drawing, "did you know our garden supports 3 different species of native bees that are critical to local plant reproduction?" Alina's heart swelled. This was more than a garden. This was education. This was preservation. This was resistance. She smoothed out the violation notice, her mind already mapping out her strategy. Gerald Whitmore and the HOA board had no idea what was coming. The Azalea Rebellion was about to begin. The Rodriguez family home office buzzed with strategic energy. Stacks of professional journals, ecological reports, and historical landscape documents covered every available surface. Marco had arrived early that morning, his briefcase overflowing with legal ammunition. "This isn't just about your garden," Marco explained, spreading a series of maps and documents across the dining room table. "This is about challenging an entire system of suburban landscape control." Sophia watched intently, her scientific curiosity piqued. She had been taking notes, creating a detailed portfolio of the garden's ecological impact. At 12 years old, she was quickly becoming her mother's most passionate ally. Alina's professional credentials told a story far more complex than the HOA board could comprehend. Her dissertation, Urban Ecosystems, Reimagining Residential Landscapes, had been praised by leading environmental scientists. She had consulted for national parks, designed sustainable urban spaces in 3 different states, and published groundbreaking research on ecosystem restoration. "They're treating landscaping like a military formation," Alina muttered, pulling up satellite images of Magnolia Estates. The overhead view revealed a shocking uniformity, blocks of identical green rectangles, devoid of any meaningful ecological diversity. Marco nodded, his legal mind already constructing the argument. Look at this. Each lawn requires approximately 620 gallons of water per day during summer. Your design reduces that by over 60%. We're talking about massive water conservation. He pulled out a series of environmental impact reports. The data was compelling. Alina's garden wasn't just different, it was scientifically superior. Native plants that required minimal water, soil preservation techniques, habitats for local pollinators that were disappearing at an alarming rate. This is our leverage, Marco said, tapping a particularly damning report. The HOA isn't just attacking your aesthetic choices. They're actively working against environmental best practices. Sophia chimed in, her research carefully documented. Mom, did you know that the bee population in our neighborhood has dropped by 40% in the last 5 years? Our garden is basically a survival zone for local pollinators. The family dynamic was unique. Where many might see a dispute over landscaping, they saw a mission. Alina's professional expertise, Marco's legal acumen, and Sophia's scientific passion created a formidable team. But the real challenge was just beginning. A knock at the door interrupted their strategy session. Elena opened it to find Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor, holding a plate of homemade cookies. I heard about the HOA notice, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice soft but determined. I want you to know not everyone in the neighborhood agrees with Gerald Whitmore. She handed Elena the plate and pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. Some of us are tired of these ridiculous rules. We're with you. When Elena unfolded the paper, she found a petition. 14 neighborhood signatures already marked the document. The first cracks in the HOA's unified front were beginning to show. Marco's eyes gleamed with professional excitement. This changes everything, he said, examining the petition. Public support isn't just helpful, it's a game changer. Elena looked at her garden through the window. What Gerald Whitmore saw as a problem, she saw as a declaration. Each plant, each carefully placed stone was a statement of resilience, of ecological wisdom. The Azalea Rebellion was gaining momentum. The Magnolia Estates clubhouse felt like a powder keg of tension when Gerald Whitmore called the emergency HOA board meeting. Fluorescent lights flickered over rows of uncomfortable chairs, casting harsh shadows on the faces of board members who had grown accustomed to unchallenged authority. This is about more than one problematic garden, Gerald began, his voice trembling with barely controlled anger. His pointer finger jabbed at a blown-up photo of Elena's landscaping, projected onto the whiteboard like a criminal exhibit. This is about maintaining the standards that make our community exceptional. Board member Linda Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. She had seen the recent news reports, the growing social media buzz. This was no longer a simple violation. It had become a public spectacle. Behind Gerald, a series of photographs documented Elena's garden in what he hoped would be done in detail. Native grasses intertwined with wildflowers, carefully placed stones creating natural water retention systems, pollinator habitats that looked nothing like the uniform street Augustine grass that dominated every other yard. We're receiving calls, Linda interjected, not just from Elena Rodriguez, but from environmental groups. The city's sustainability office wants to review our landscaping guidelines. Gerald's face reddened. This was spinning out of control. Unbeknownst to the board, Sophia Rodriguez had orchestrated her own intelligence gathering. A small drone, a birthday gift from her uncle Marco, had captured high-resolution images of the entire neighborhood. Her science project was becoming something far more significant. A comprehensive ecological assessment of Magnolia Estates. The Rodriguez family wasn't just fighting, they were documenting. Outside the clubhouse, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors whispered, some holding signs supporting Elena's garden. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly neighbor who had provided the initial petition, stood front and center. Local environmental activists mixed with curious residents, creating a growing groundswell of support. We have satellite data, Marco had told Elena that morning. Water usage, ecological impact, biodiversity metrics. We're not just making an argument, we're presenting scientific evidence. Gerald's assistant nervously approached, sliding a folder of recent communications across the table. Emails from the city's environmental department, inquiries from local news stations, a letter from a state-level environmental conservation group expressing interest in the case. This was no longer just about one garden. It was becoming a referendum on suburban landscaping practices. "We're being watched," Linda warned Gerald. "This isn't like our previous violations. People are paying attention." The board members exchanged nervous glances. The comfortable bubble of unchallenged authority was rapidly deflating. Sophia's drone footage told a story the HOA didn't want to hear. Each yard was a monoculture, identical, resource-intensive, ecologically dead. Alina's garden stood in stark contrast, a vibrant, living ecosystem that challenged everything the HOA represented. Gerald Whitmore understood then that this was more than a battle. This was a potential revolution in how suburban landscapes were conceived, managed, and appreciated. The Azalea Rebellion was no longer just Alina's fight. It had become a movement. Marco Rodriguez's law office looked more like an ecological war room than a legal workspace. Whiteboards covered with complex diagrams, stacks of environmental research papers, and a massive digital display tracking every aspect of the Magnolia Estates landscaping dispute dominated the space. "This isn't just about winning a case," Marco explained to his research team. "This is about establishing a precedent that could change how HOAs regulate residential landscapes nationwide." His lead paralegal, Rajesh Kumar, had been digging through historical HOA cases. "Look at this," he said, pulling up a series of digital files. "We found at least 17 similar cases across 3 states where homeowners challenged restrictive landscaping guidelines, but none have been as comprehensively documented as Alina's." The legal strategy was multi-layered. Marco wasn't just preparing to defend Alina. He was building a comprehensive attack on outdated suburban landscaping regulations. Expert witnesses were being lined up. Dr. Elena Cortez, a leading urban ecology researcher, had already agreed to testify. Her recent study on residential ecosystem impact would be a bombshell. Then there was Dr. James Harris from the state's Environmental Conservation Department, who had expressed keen interest in the case. Sophia's contributions were proving unexpectedly valuable. Her drone footage and ecological documentation were becoming critical pieces of evidence. She had meticulously mapped the biodiversity of Alina's garden, creating a visual and scientific narrative that was hard to ignore. "Look at this population density map," Sophia told her uncle, pointing to a complex graphic showing pollinator interactions. "Our garden supports 3 times more ecological diversity than the surrounding properties." Marco's computer pinged, an email from the Environmental Protection Agency's regional office. They were requesting additional information about the case, hinting at a potential broader investigation into HOA landscaping practices. The legal team had uncovered a treasure trove of ammunition. Water usage reports showed that traditional lawn maintenance consumed exponentially more resources than Alina's native plant design. Carbon impact studies demonstrated the environmental cost of maintaining uniform grass landscapes. "We're not just fighting a local HOA," Marco told Alina during a strategy session. "We're challenging an entire system of suburban ecological management." A knock at the door interrupted their planning. A courier delivered a thick envelope. Additional documentation from local environmental groups who had heard about the case. Support was building from unexpected quarters. Gerald Whitmore had no idea what was coming. The legal preparation was meticulous. Marco had divided their approach into multiple strategic layers. Challenge the HOA's landscaping guidelines. Demonstrate the ecological superiority of native plant designs. Expose the environmental impact of traditional lawn maintenance. Create a blueprint for future residential landscape disputes. Sophia watched her uncle work, her scientific mind already racing ahead. "This could change everything," she whispered, thinking about the potential impact on urban ecosystems. Marco looked up, a rare smile crossing his face. "This is about more than one garden," he said. "This is about reimagining how we live with our environment." The Azalea Rebellion was preparing for its most significant battle yet. The community center's main hall buzzed with an electricity that felt more like a pivotal political rally than a neighborhood HOA hearing. Every seat was filled, with people lining the walls and spilling into the hallway. Local news vans were parked outside, their satellite dishes pointed toward the building like mechanical sentinels. Elena stood at the podium, her presentation carefully crafted to be both scientifically rigorous and emotionally compelling. Behind her, a massive digital display showed comparative ecological impact studies of traditional lawns versus native landscape designs. Sophia had spent weeks helping her mother prepare, creating intricate infographics that transformed complex scientific data into visually stunning narratives. Gerald Whitmore sat in the front row, his posture rigid, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room's atmosphere was thick with tension, anticipation hanging like static electricity. "This isn't about a single garden," Elena began, her voice steady and clear. "This is about reimagining our relationship with the environment we inhabit." Her presentation was a masterpiece of scientific communication. Each slide told a story: water conservation metrics, pollinator population studies, carbon sequestration data. She walked the audience through the intricate ecosystem her garden represented, transforming what the HOA saw as chaos into a meticulously designed living system. Marco sat nearby, a strategic observer. His legal team had prepared for every possible counterargument. Mrs. Thompson, who had become an unexpected ally, nodded encouragingly from the third row. The most unexpected testimony came from Dr. Eleanor Richards, a retired EPA scientist who lived in the neighborhood. Her appearance was a calculated surprise. "In my 40 years of environmental research," she stated, her voice carrying the weight of decades of scientific expertise, "I have rarely seen a residential landscape that so perfectly demonstrates ecological principles." Gerald's face grew progressively redder. This was not the straightforward hearing he had anticipated. What began as a simple violation had transformed into a comprehensive challenge of suburban landscaping paradigms. Sophia's drone footage played on the large screen, a visual journey through the garden's ecological complexity. Pollinator movements, water flow patterns, plant interactions. Each frame told a story of intricate environmental design. The room was captivated. Neighbors who had once viewed Elena as a troublemaker now listened with growing respect and understanding. The HOA's traditional narrative of uniformity was crumbling under the weight of scientific evidence. "We're not just talking about plants," Elena continued. "We're discussing a fundamental reimagining of how we live within our environment. Each garden can be a micro-ecosystem, a critical piece of our larger environmental puzzle." Marco caught her eye and gave a subtle nod. They both understood this was about far more than winning a single dispute. This was about establishing a new framework for residential landscaping. As Elena concluded her presentation, the room erupted into applause. Gerald Whitmore looked shell-shocked, the foundation of his rigid worldview visibly cracking. The Azalea Rebellion had found its voice. The media storm descended with unprecedented fury. What had begun as a local HOA dispute transformed overnight into a national conversation about environmental sustainability, individual rights, and the future of suburban landscapes. Local news stations were just the beginning. Within 48 hours, national networks picked up the story. Suburban Showdown. One garden's fight against HOA conformity ran as a headline on major news websites. Social media exploded with support. Hashtags like #AzaleaRebellion and #GardenFreedom trending nationwide. Rachel Winters, a prominent environmental journalist, arrived in Magnolia Estates to cover the story in depth. Her initial interview with Elena Rodriguez would become a turning point in the narrative. "This isn't about rebellion," Elena explained during the interview, Sophia quietly taking notes in the background. "This is about restoration. Each plant in my garden is a small act of ecological healing." The Rodriguez family strategy was multifaceted. Marco handled legal communications. Elena managed the scientific narrative. Sophia became an unexpected social media sensation, her young voice adding a powerful generational perspective to the ecological argument. A viral video captured Sophia explaining the garden's ecological impact. "1 square meter of my mom's garden supports more life than an entire block of traditional lawns," she had said, her passion and scientific precision captivating millions. Environmental organizations began reaching out. The National Wildlife Federation expressed interest in using Alina's garden as a case study. Sustainable landscaping groups saw an opportunity to challenge decades of suburban design conventions. Gerald Whitmore found himself at the center of a media hurricane he never anticipated. Local news stations camped outside the HOA office, demanding comments. His carefully controlled narrative was unraveling with each passing hour. Behind the scenes, Marco's legal team was preparing for the next phase. They weren't just fighting a local HOA violation. They were building a comprehensive legal challenge to restrictive landscaping regulations across the country. Universities began showing interest. Dr. Elena Cortez from the Urban Ecology Research Institute reached out, proposing a comprehensive study of the Rodriguez Garden. What had started as a local dispute was becoming a significant research opportunity. The economic implications were becoming clear. Real estate experts began discussing how native landscaping could impact property values. Water conservation studies highlighted the potential savings of Alina's approach. Social media became a battleground of ideas. Gardening forums, environmental groups, and community activists shared Alina's story. Memes, infographics, and passionate discussions spread faster than the HOA could manage. Unexpected allies emerged. Landscape architects, environmental scientists, and even some progressive HOA board members from other communities began to voice support. The Rodriguez Garden had become a symbol of something much larger than a single neighborhood dispute. Sophia recorded a video for her school's science project, documenting the garden's ecological impact. "This isn't just about plants," she said, her eyes bright with determination. "This is about how we choose to live with our environment." The Azalea Rebellion had become more than a local fight. It was a movement. The administrative hearing room felt more like a courtroom of environmental reckoning. Rows of chairs were filled with local residents, environmental activists, and media representatives. The tension was palpable, a collective breath held in anticipation of a decision that would extend far beyond Magnolia Estates. Marco Rodriguez stood with the confidence of a warrior who had meticulously prepared for battle. His legal strategy was a carefully constructed weapon of scientific precision and legal expertise. Stacks of research papers, ecological impact studies, and expert testimonies formed an impressive arsenal. Gerald Whitmore looked diminished. The once powerful HOA board president now appeared small, his previously immaculate suit slightly rumpled, his confidence visibly eroded by weeks of public scrutiny. Dr. Eleanor Richards, the retired EPA scientist, took the stand first. Her testimony was a masterclass in ecological expertise. "What Alina Rodriguez has created," she stated, her voice clear and authoritative, "is not a violation. It's a model of responsible landscape design." Sophia sat beside her mother, her notebook filled with intricate diagrams and ecological data. She had become more than just a supportive daughter. She was a critical part of their strategic team. The administrative panel consisted of 3 individuals: a local environmental scientist, a city planning expert, and a community representative. They listened intently, their expressions a mixture of professional curiosity and growing admiration for the Rodriguez family's comprehensive approach. Marco's opening statement was surgical. "This case is not about a single garden," he began. "This is about reimagining our relationship with the environment. The HOA's guidelines are not just outdated, they are actively harmful to our local ecosystem." He presented a comprehensive portfolio: water conservation metrics, pollinator population studies, carbon sequestration data, economic impact of sustainable landscaping. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the HOA's argumentative coffin. The traditional lawn maintenance approach was exposed as environmentally destructive, resource-intensive, and economically inefficient. Alina's testimony was equally powerful. She spoke not just as a homeowner, but as a professional landscape architect with decades of experience. "Our gardens are not just decorative spaces," she explained. "They are living ecosystems, critical components of our urban environment." The most unexpected moment came when Mrs. Thompson, the elderly neighbor who had first supported Alina, took the stand. Her testimony was a personal history of the neighborhood, a powerful narrative of how suburban landscapes had changed, and not for the better. "I've lived here for 50 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of observation. "What Elena has done is bring life back to our community." Gerald Whitmore's legal team had been reduced to ineffective objections and increasingly desperate arguments. Their carefully maintained narrative of uniformity was crumbling under the weight of scientific evidence and passionate testimony. Sophia caught her mother's eye and gave a subtle smile. They both understood that this was about more than winning a single case. This was about changing a paradigm. The administrative panel began their deliberations. The room held its collective breath. The Azalea Rebellion had reached its critical moment. The decision came down on a crisp autumn morning, with sunlight filtering through the leaves of Elena's now famous garden. The administrative panel's ruling was unprecedented, not just a victory, but a comprehensive reimagining of residential landscaping guidelines. Magnolia Estates would be required to completely revise its HOA regulations. The new guidelines would prioritize ecological sustainability, native plant species, and water conservation. Gerald Whitmore was removed from the HOA board, his once unassailable position now a cautionary tale of rigid bureaucracy. "This is about more than one garden," Elena told the gathered reporters, Sophia standing proudly beside her. "This is about how we choose to live with our environment." The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Environmental groups began using the Rodriguez Garden as a blueprint for sustainable residential design. Universities requested detailed studies of the ecosystem Elena had cultivated. Landscape architects from across the country reached out, seeking to understand her innovative approach. Marco's phone didn't stop ringing. Lawyers from other states consulted him about similar HOA challenges. What had begun as a local dispute had become a national conversation about environmental responsibility and individual property rights. The economic implications were unexpected. Real estate agents began highlighting native landscaping as a valuable property feature. Water conservation experts estimated that widespread adoption of Elena's approach could save millions of gallons of water annually. Sophia's role in the movement continued to grow. She was invited to speak at environmental youth conferences, her passionate advocacy connecting a new generation to ecological thinking. Her science fair project, a comprehensive study of her mother's garden, won national recognition. Mrs. Thompson's testimony had become legendary in the community. Neighbors who once maintained sterile, uniform lawns began experimenting with native plants. The entire neighborhood was slowly transforming, one garden at a time. The Magnolia Estates Community Center hosted a special meeting to celebrate the new landscaping guidelines. Elena was honored not as a rebellious homeowner, but as a visionary who had fundamentally changed how the community understood its relationship with nature. "We're not just growing plants," Elena would often say. "We're growing a new way of thinking." Gerald Whitmore, once the untouchable HOA board president, found himself a marginalized figure. The very uniformity he had championed had become a symbol of environmental short-sightedness. National environmental publications ran feature stories. The Azalea Rebellion, as the case had been dubbed, became a landmark moment in suburban ecological design. Universities added case studies to their environmental science curricula. For the Rodriguez family, the victory was deeply personal. What had started as a defense of their garden had become a movement. Marco continued to work on similar cases, Elena expanded her landscape design consulting, and Sophia prepared for a future in environmental science. As autumn leaves danced around the garden that had started it all, Elena looked at her daughter. "Sometimes," she said, "changing the world starts right in your own backyard." The Azalea Rebellion had transformed from a local dispute into a national movement of ecological hope.